Good evening, everyone. My name's Kynan Thistlethwaite. I'm with the Jose Vega campaign. I'm filling in for Jose as your introductory speaker for today. Jose right now is actually doing a program with Jimmy Dore. Um, so that's why I'm in his shoes today. I want to welcome you all and welcome everyone that's been participating in the classes for the past three or so more months that we've been doing this. Um, Jose is actually going to be on to talk about a major international conference that he'll be participating in. I'll also be a featured speaker in the fifth panel. It's the Schiller Institute Conference, A Beautiful Vision for Humanity in Times of Great Turbulence. We're less than 2 weeks away. It's going to be Memorial Day weekend, May 24th to 25th in the New York metropolitan area. I would encourage everyone to register for that conference on the Schiller Institute website. Some of the speakers there who actually participated in today's meeting of the International Peace Coalition, the 102nd consecutive meeting of the coalition, will be speaking. People like Ray McGovern, who just returned from his trip to Moscow with Oliver Stone, Scott Ritter, a former UN weapons inspector in Iraq, who I think a lot of people are familiar with, and many others. Her Excellency Naledi Pandor, the former Foreign Minister of South Africa, will be speaking on the first panel as well. Um, so it's going to be incredibly exciting. I encourage everyone to attend. Um, and I will just also say, um, in our meeting of the International Peace Coalition, we had a Israeli peace activist speaking, Maoz Inon, who gave a report on People's Peace Summit in Jerusalem. He personally, along with others, have been leading demonstrations in Jerusalem to oppose this horrific genocide, and he had the opportunity to speak on our platform just to give you a sense of the kind of people that we're in dialogue with, and what we're doing to build a new security and development architecture among all nations to end these endless wars, to stop the genocide. So I think without further ado, I'll just go straight to you, Dennis, for our program today on Edgar Poe.
Okay, well, I want to thank everybody for being here. Obviously, this is a little bit different than we usually do. It's about a half an hour after we usually start. And of course, Jose's still on finishing the program that he is doing with Jimmy Dore. And as was mentioned, there'll be this conference that will be happening next week. If that's successful, then there will be thousands of people that will assemble for that conference, and that won't be necessarily in person, but in person and online. The conference is going to be both. Uh, Now, many assemblies are happening, and many assemblies always happen all over the world. What makes this one different is that the intent of the assembly is to um, distill, I think is the best term, a number of people who are more committed to truth than to their particular systems of thinking. Tonight's story, Edgar Poe's story, is called Some Words with a Mummy. And it deals with a theme which is worth talking about a little bit. Some of you may remember, those of you who are young enough to have, or rather old enough to remember this, and young enough to think about it, that in 2003, it's also happened in a different way in 1991, slightly different. But in 2003, when the United States conducted what was a criminal invasion of Iraq, based on nothing, based on reports which were known to be false at the time that they were given, a form of warfare that was uh, declared illegal in the Nuremberg tribunals of the late 40s. One of the markers of that invasion was the destruction of the Baghdad Library. If you were to look around at wars, particularly after the year 2000, but even going into the 1990s with the original Desert Storm of 1990-91, you will note that there was a great destruction of artifacts, ancient artifacts. Certainly in the recent bombings of Gaza, there have been destruction of churches, mosques. Many documents have been lost. And that image of American soldiers, not large numbers of them, but American soldiers standing by while the Baghdad library was looted and the museum was looted, is exemplary of what the actual greatest casualty is of these wars. Although, of course, the human death meted out in these conflicts is of great concern. The destruction of the memory of humanity, of 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 not merely the great achievements of earlier humanity, but the destruction of the ability of future generations to know the story of how humanity has not merely progressed, but how regression also occurs. Because we're going through a period like that in the transatlantic world, particularly in the United States and in Europe, and not for the reasons that people say. We're going through this because we have lost the passion for thinking, for discovery, and for the application of new ideas to the transformation of our world. This has been said to be imperialist science, imperialist culture. It's anything but that. But that's the way that it basically has been denounced. It's often denounced as the pernicious and poisonous product of dead white European males, for example. Sometimes it's correctly stated that there are mythical historical narratives that are being given about human development and human progress, in which certain ethnic or racial stereotypes, so-called racial stereotypes, there's only one human race, there is no such thing as races. Whenever you hear the use of the term black race, Asian race by anybody, it just demonstrates the lack of education of all such persons. That's the kind of thing that's recently plagued, for example, some of the rulings, some of the decrees, some of the presidential messages that have come out of the White House. But when you're seeing that, what you're seeing is a society in decline. Remember that most societies that have ever been in so-called civilizations, cultures that have ever been assembled, erected in the history of humanity have failed. Most of history is comprised of failures. And while there's no denying that many civilizations in the past, Mayan civilization, for example, others, had great achievements, there's also no denying their failure. The United States is the oldest continuous federal republic in human history. That's something that should be noted. Say, well, we don't know about other parts of human history. Well, let me put it this way. If such things existed and they failed, then we know that they failed, but we have no evidence at the moment of their previous existence. But one of the reasons we don't have the evidence of the existence of certain societies is precisely what we saw the United States carry out in 2003 in Iraq, and what we're seeing go on right now in Gaza. So the sort of the hatred of the mind of humanity, the visceral hatred. There's a certain kind of racism which is opposed to the human race. And there are people who are racists against the human race. And they tend to make or have explanations about the characteristics of portions of humanity, which are clearly deeply offensive, also quite wrong. And to that degree, I do not mean to, in any sense, minimize that phenomenon and the fact that that phenomenon is very, very widespread and often is the visceral underpinning of what is referred to as foreign policy, what is referred to as domestic policy. Like, for example, when you keep hearing this term, the Chinese, as though there were not various dynasties of China, as though there are not literally hundreds of, and more than hundreds of ethnic groups in China, as though there are not different portions of language cultures in what ancient and modern China. There's this term, the Chinese. I hear it all the time. Uh, and if you know anything about the background of the United States, particularly in the 19th century and early 20th century, you know that other than black people who have the distinction of having the Dred Scott decision, which was passed the 1850s, the Chinese have the unique distinction of being the one ethnic group against whom laws were passed, like the Chinese Exclusion Act of the period of the 1880s in the United States. Passed, by the way, after there had been a very important, productive exchange between China in 1860-61, when it was still subjugated by the British, and the then United States' ambassador to China, Anson Burlingame. Burlingame, who became so beloved of the Chinese that when his tenure of office was over for the United States, he became the Chinese ambassador to the United States and also to Europe. And the closeness of the collaboration alarmed those that were trying, in the context of the aftermath of the American War of 1861 to 65, particularly in the 1880s. They wanted to reverse the course of what should have been a massive economic and industrial expansion of the United States, which did not occur. It was what was referred to as Reconstruction. But by 1876, that had been largely closed down. And in the aftermath of that, you had the Chinese Exclusion Act that was passed. It was essentially not really reversed until the 1940s, when then, at that point, because of the fighting against the Japanese, it was necessary. It was thought to be prudent to then reverse the Chinese Exclusion Act, although up until as late as the mid 1960s in certain portions of the American South, it was illegal for Chinese to even own property. This is important to understand. So when you're hearing this about the Chinese, go back and look at the various books that were published, particularly in the 1920s, that talked about what was called then the Yellow Peril. There was a particular book called The Passing of the Great Race. Maybe I can find the link to that, and you can go take a look at that, because that's the kind of thing that might help you to understand how deeply the notion of a certain kind of anti-human racism was characteristic of American immigration policy, yes, but just the American outlook, coming primarily, by the way, out of Harvard University and out of the Northeast of the United States. This was not primarily a Southern phenomenon. It was something that was most identified with an individual by the name of Lothrop Stoddard and a few other people who were Klansmen, but they were Klansmen of the Harvard variety. Those people that were associated with people later like William Yandell Elliott, the person that taught Kissinger and Brzezinski, came out of the Nashville agrarian movement, something that we won't talk about here, although these were people who were generically deep enemies of the factions that supported people like Edgar Poe. So we're going through that because that's the background of tonight's story. Just to say a bit about Stoddard. he was a founding member of the American Birth Control League, which later became Planned Parenthood, uh, and was this is something that he wrote just to give you a sense of it. This is in a book he called "The Rising Tide of Color Against White Supremacy," and he said this: "To begin with, the Black peoples have no historic pasts. Never having evolved civilizations of their own, they are practically devoid of that accumulated mass of beliefs, thoughts, and experiences which render Asiatics so impenetrable and so hostile to white influences. Although the white race displays sustained destructive power to an unrivaled degree, particularly in its Nordic branches, the brown and yellow peoples have contributed greatly to the civilization of the world and have profoundly influenced human progress. The Negro, on the contrary, has contributed virtually nothing. Left to himself, he remained a savage, and in the past, his only quickening has been where brown men have imposed their ideas and altered his blood. The originating powers of the European and the Asiatic are not in him." This is a book from the 1920s. As I said, you can get that online if you're interested. The Rising Tide of Color Against White Supremacy. So, for those of you who thought that that term, white supremacy, was merely an epithet which was intended to indicate racism, this is the term that was being used by such racists to describe their belief structure. And these are people, as I say, out of the Harvard milieu. So it's important to just keep that in mind. I will also, by the way, though, indicate that many of these people can also be found in the early founders of the environmentalist movement. And that's a story for another day. We won't go through that here. But I'll just indicate that one of the more famous of these, not one of the founders, but just a famous person, was named Julian Huxley, brother of Aldous Huxley, and the founder of UNESCO, United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization. So for people who are, and certainly Aldous Huxley, who wrote Brave New World, people like to talk about him because of his pro-drug, pro-hallucinogenics positions, as stated in The Doors of Perception. So it's very fashionable still to cite Huxley and this idea of the promotion of psychedelics and how this is so progressive. Well, actually, his brother was one of the arch racists of the 1920s. And at another time, I'll take up other elements of this. And what relevant reason to say this is because what their aim was to destroy real artifacts of history, real original sources, to dissuade people from looking at real artifacts and real original sources, which, by the way, is much of what goes on the internet today. The internet is not your friend. It may be able to be used as a tool, but it is not your friend. And I'll give you an example of something from tonight's story. In the course of the story, Edgar Poe refers at one point to an ancient city in Egypt. He calls it Aznak, Aznac. If you try to find that, and it could be mythical, excuse me, what you will see is that you'll be continually referred to not that, but something else, which is the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps, because they will say it's not, you don't mean AZNAC, you mean ANZAC. It just keeps doing that. So what I did was, since this kept happening, I put in Edgar Allan Poe. I didn't put that in. I put Edgar Poe, but they put Edgar Allan Poe. Ancient city of Aznak, because I wanted to try to get around what I thought was a dysfunction, perhaps, in the search. Well, AI came up with something, and AI said this: Edgar Allan Poe, the famous American writer, has a connection to Anzac, the Australia, right? Though not in the way you might expect. Anzac, also known as the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps, was a group of soldiers during World War I. And while Poe lived during a different time, his writings and life story have connections to the area where the Anzac soldiers were stationed. What's this possibly means? You keep reading. And then it says the Anzac soldiers fought in World War I in areas like Gallipoli in present day Turkey, which is quite distant from Poe's life and writings. While Poe is not directly associated with Anzac, his stories and themes he explores, such as loss, the afterlife, and the mysteries of human nature, have resonated with many people, including those who have served in war or experienced similar tragedies. Okay, so it keeps going. You're waiting for the punchline, right? While Poe wasn't a soldier or a direct witness to the horrors of war, his explorations of human suffering and the power of the human spirit can offer a different perspective on the experiences of those who fought in wars, like the Anzac campaign. Okay. In essence, and it goes on like this, while Poe's life and the Anzac campaign are geographically and chronologically distant, his writings and the themes they explore can offer a different that goes on. So it just goes to show that AI is capable of thorough, unmitigated bullshit. In no way is any of this relevant or true. And it's a useful thing to understand, because the important thing is that what you would like to have said is, I don't know. I don't see any, there is no connection known here. Maybe there's another search. So I just thought I would tell that story because it's useful to illustrate, because actually I happen to think there's a way that I may be able to help AI. I'm just going to try something here with you on the phone. Anzac, Egypt. Okay.
I'm here too, by the way. Just
okay. So it says Anzac, Egypt. A month before the Gallipoli landing, Australian troops were involved in the first incident of what would become known as the Wasser riots. The troops rampaged through shops in a district of Cairo, known for its bars and brothels, setting fire to some of the businesses and brawling with staff and owners. Well, now see, that at least gets close to tonight's story, because the story, Some Words with a Mummy, is set in both Egypt and, let's say, Northern Africa. They could have come up with that, but the machine is too stupid. AI is too stupid to have done that. And I think it's important to see that, because when we do get to the story, you'll see that this is what the story is about. This whole arc of an introduction I gave you is about what tonight's story is about, which is the comeuppance of arrogance. So, Jose, since you're there, why don't you say hello to people and we'll come back to the story.
Sure. Hi, everyone. And if you're also just coming in from the Jimmy Dore show, by the way, because you just saw me there, and this is your first time here and you're confused as to why there's somebody who doesn't look like me on my stream, it's because we do these every Friday. Every Friday we do a class on Edgar Poe, and I would urge you to rewind to the beginning of this program, preferably when we're done, but you can also watch the stream 15 minutes behind thanks to the power of YouTube. So feel free to do that as well if you would like. Other than that, thank you for joining us, and I'm happy to be jumping in here. I just heard your little quibble, I'll put it that way, with AI, Dennis. Yeah, I think I'll that's what I'll say now. Yeah.
Well, may don't you just say something also about the conference, because we didn't do that, and we indicated you would.
Yeah. Okay. No problem. Sure. So we are having a conference Memorial Day weekend, and I'm going to pull up the invitation right now on my computer here. So it's called A Beautiful Vision for Humanity. And if you were just also watching on the Jimmy Dore show, you would have seen that I had just kind of gave a big pitch for it, where we are going to have such an extraordinary lineup of speakers, almost unprecedented, actually, where we are going to have Helga Zeppelrush, Naledi Pandor, And Helga Zepp-LaRouche was the founder of the Schiller Institute. Naledi Pandor, the former Minister of International Relations and Cooperation of South Africa. She's the woman who brought the case against Israel to the International Court of Justice. Professor Dmitry Trenin, the academic supervisor of the Institute of World Military Economy and Strategy at the Higher School of Economics, University in Moscow. Professor Zhang Weiwei, professor of international relations at Fudan University, China. Former president of Guyana, Donald Ramotar. Ambassador Jack Matlock, former ambassador to the Soviet Union. Ambassador Chaz Freeman, former Assistant Secretary of Defense for the International Security Affairs. Ray McGovern, former senior analyst, U.S. CIA, U.S. Central Intelligence, former analyst for the Central Intelligence Agency. He's a founding member of the Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity. He also has just come back from a trip from Russia, where he was there with Oliver Stone, meeting with very important Russian officials such as Peskov. He was giving speeches to audiences that had people like Lavrov in it and even Vladimir Putin. And we also have Scott Ritter, who was the former UN weapons inspector. He will also be there in person as well. And we also have a panel on culture. We're going to have a lot of music. We're going to have a lot of performers. Then we're going to have people like our friends here internally, for example, Bob Baker, Marcia Baker, Paul Gallagher, Jason Ross, all of these people who have been longtime organizers and members of this organization to bring these ideas to life. We're going to have some video statements and addresses from Sergei Glaziev and from Michelle Geraci, former Undersecretary of State, Ministry of Economic Development in Italy, Professor of Practice and Economic Policy at Nottingham University, Honorary Professor of Peking University School of Economics, and an adjunct Professor of Finance at NYU Shanghai. And then I will be also one of these panelists as well, on one of these panels with my friends of the youth movement. And we're going to have, of course, videos from Lyndon LaRouche, Diane Sayre, who is the current president of the LaRouche organization, who is a former independent candidate for the U.S. Senate in New York. And my favorite panel is going to compose of people like Jacques Cheminade, who is a former presidential candidate, who is the president of Solidarité et Progrès. Kelvin Kem of South Africa was a nuclear physicist, past chairman and of South Africa Nuclear Energy Corporation. Will Happer, who is a professor emeritus of physics, Princeton University, former member, U.S. National Security Council and the U.S. Department of Energy. Steve Durst, who is a part of the International Lunar Observatory Association, and Jason Ross, who is the science advisor to the Schiller Institute. While I was on the program, Jimmy had asked me, what panel am I most excited for? And I would say it's definitely the last two. Earth's next 50 years and shaping the future, and having a real engaged high-level discussion on the nature of science, discovery, creativity, and how to preserve that going forward. And that is what's going to be happening Memorial Day weekend. And I would urge everybody who is watching, whether now or in posterity, to definitely tune in to that conference Memorial Day weekend. It's going to be big, it's going to be historic, and it's going to be a point where we make a commitment right there and then, after this long dialectical process there, to make a commitment to make the world a better place through an international vision. So that's my pitch for the conference. Dennis, back to you.
Okay, so here's what we should do, Jose. You have a copy of the story?
I can pull one up
with a mummy.
Yeah. Yes, I do.
Okay, let's get that up. And and I'd like it if you could start off, because there's a letter that has to be read in a different voice. I will do the letter, and why don't you just take the first narration piece, and then maybe I'll take it or somebody else. Let's line up another. I asked before, we have some other readers lined up, right? We're going to need at least another two.
Yes, we have another two.
Okay, great. So why don't you start us off?
Some Words with a Mummy by Edgar A. Poe. The symposium of the preceding evening had been a little too much for my nerves. I had a wretched headache and was desperately drowsy and was desperately drowsy. Instead of going out, therefore, to spend the evening as I had proposed, it occurred to me that I could not do a wiser thing than just eat a mouthful of supper and go immediately to bed. A light supper, of course. I am exceedingly fond of Welsh rarebit. More than a pound at once, however, may not at all times be advisable. Still, there can be no material objection to 2. And really, between 2 and 3, there is merely a single unit of difference. I ventured, perhaps, upon 4. My wife will have it 5, but clearly she has confounded 2 very distinct affairs. The abstract number, 5, I am willing to admit, but concretely, it has reference to bottles of brown stout, without which, in the way of condiment, Welsh rarebit is to be eschewed. Having thus concluded a frugal meal, and donned my nightcap with the serene hope of enjoying it until noon the next day, I placed my head upon the pillow, and through the aid of a capital conscience, fell into a profound slumber forthwith. But when were the hopes of humanity fulfilled? I could not have completed my 3rd snore when there came a furious ringing at the street doorbell, and then an impatient thumping at the knocker, which awakened me at once. And a minute afterward, and while I was still rubbing my eyes, my wife thrust in my face a note from my old friend, Dr. Ponemer. It ran thus: Come to me
by all means, my dear good friend, as soon as you receive this. Come and ask us and help us to rejoice. At last, by long, persevering diplomacy, I have gained the assent of the directors of the City Museum to my examination of the mummy. You know the one I mean. I have permission to unswathe it and open it if desirable. A few friends only will be present. You, of course. The mummy is now at my house, and we shall begin to unroll it at 11 tonight. Yours ever, Ponener.
By the time I had reached the Ponener, it struck me that I was as wide awake as a man need be. I leapt out of bed in an ecstasy, overthrowing all in my way, dressed myself with a rapidity truly marvelous, and set off at the top of my speed for the doctor's. There I found a very eager company assembled. They had been awaiting me with much impatience. The mummy was extended upon the dining table, and the moment I entered, its examination was commenced. It was one of a pair brought several years previously by Captain Arthur Sabratash, a cousin of Ponemer's, from a tomb near Elatheus in the Libyan mountains, a considerable distance above Thebes on the Nile. The grottos at this point, although less magnificent than the Theban sepulchres, are of higher interest on account of affording more numerous illustrations of the private life of the Egyptians. The chamber from which our specimens was taken was said to be very rich in such illustrations, the walls being completely covered with fresco paintings and bas-reliefs, while statues, vases, and mosaic work of rich patterns indicated the vast wealth of the deceased. The treasure had been deposited in the museum precisely in the condition in which Captain Sabratash had found it. That is to say, the coffin had not been disturbed. For 8 years it had thus stood, subject only externally to public inspection. We had now, therefore, the complete mummy at our disposal. And to those who are aware how very rarely the unransacked antique reached our shores, it will be evident at once that we had great reason to congratulate ourselves upon our good fortune. I'll do one more paragraph and then maybe someone could take over. Approaching the table, I saw upon it a large box or case, nearly 7 feet long and perhaps 3 feet wide by 2.5 feet deep. It was oblong, not coffin-shaped. The material was at first supposed to be the wood of the sycamore, platanus, but upon cutting into it, we found it to be pasteboard, or more properly, papier-mâché, composed of papyrus. It was thickly ornamented with paintings representing funeral scenes and other mournful subjects, interspersed among which, in every variety of position, were certain series of hieroglyphical characters intended, no doubt, for the name of the departed. By good luck, Mr. Glidden formed one of our party, and he had no difficulty in translating the letters, which were simply phonetic and represented the word alla mistakio.
Alla mistako. We had some difficulty in getting this case open without injury, but having at length accomplished the task, we came to a second, coffin-shaped and very considerably less in size than the exterior one, but resembling it precisely in every other respect. The interval between the two was filled with resin, which had in some degree defaced the colors of the interior box. Upon opening this latter, which we did quite easily, we arrived at a third case, also coffin-shaped and varying from the second one in no particular, except in that of its material, which was cedar, and still emitted the peculiar and highly aromatic odor of that wood. Between the second and the third case there was no interval, the one fitting accurately within the other. Removing the third case, we discovered and took out the body itself. We had expected to find it, as usual, enveloped in frequent rolls or bandages of linen. But in place of these, we found a sort of sheath made of papyrus and coated with a layer of plaster, thickly gilt and painted. The paintings represented subjects connected with the various supposed duties of the soul and its presentation to different divinities, with numerous identical human figures intended, very probably, as portraits of the persons embalmed. Extending from head to foot was a columnar or perpendicular inscription in phonetic hieroglyphics, giving again his name and titles, and the names and titles of his relations. Around the neck, thus ensheathed, was a collar of cylindrical glass beads, diverse in color, and so arranged as to form images of deities, of the Scarabaeus, etc., with the winged globe. Around the small of the waist was a similar collar or belt. Stripping off the papyrus, we found the flesh in excellent preservation, with no perceptible odor. The color was reddish. The skin was hard, smooth, and glossy. The teeth and hair were in good condition. The eyes, it seemed, had been removed and glass ones substituted, which were very beautiful and wonderfully lifelike, with the exception of somewhat too determined a stare. The fingers and the nails were brilliantly gilded. Mr. Glidden was of opinion, from the redness of the epidermis, that the embalmment had been effected together by asphaltum. But, on scraping the surface with a steel instrument, and throwing into the fire some of the powder thus obtained, the flavor of camphor and other sweet-scented gums became apparent. We searched the corpse very carefully for the usual openings through which the entrails are extracted, but to our surprise, we could discover none. No member of the party was at that period aware that entire or unopened mummies are not infrequently met. The brain it was customary to withdraw through the nose, the intestines through an incision in the side. The body was then shaved, washed, and salted, then laid aside for several weeks, when the operation of embalming, properly so called, began. As no trace of an opening could be found, Dr. Ponnonner was preparing his instruments for dissection, when I observed that it was then past 2 o'clock. Hereupon it was agreed to postpone the internal examination until the next evening, and we were about to separate for the present, when someone suggested an experiment or two with the voltaic pile. The application of electricity to a mummy 3,000 or 4,000 years old at least was an idea, if not very sage, still efficiently original, and we all caught it at once. About 1/10 in earnest and 9/10 in jest, we arranged a battery in the doctor's study and conveyed thither the Egyptian. It was only after much trouble that we succeeded in laying bare some portions of the temporal muscle, which appeared of less stony rigidity than other parts of the frame, but which, as we had anticipated, of course, gave no indication of galvanic susceptibility when brought in contact with the wire. This, the first trial, indeed seemed decisive, and with a hearty laugh at our own absurdity, we were bidding each other good night when my eyes, happening to fall upon those of the mummy, were there immediately riveted in amazement. My brief glance, in fact, had sufficed to assure me that the orbs which we had all supposed to be glass, and which were originally noticeable for a certain wild stare, were now so far covered by the lids that only a small portion of the tunica albuginea remained visible.
Whites of the eyes.
With a shout, I called attention to the fact, and it became immediately obvious to all. I cannot say that I was alarmed at the phenomenon, because alarmed is, in my case, not exactly the word. It is possible, however, that, but for the brown stout, I might have been a little nervous. As for the rest of the company, they really made no attempt at concealing the downright fright which possessed them. Dr. Poniner was a man to be pitied. Mr. Glidden, by some peculiar process, rendered himself invisible. Mr. Silk Buckingham, I fancy, will scarcely be so bold as to deny that he made his way upon all fours under the table. After the first shock of astonishment, however, we resolved, as a matter of course, upon further experiment forthwith. Our operations were now directed against the great toe of the right foot. We made an incision over the outside of the exterior os sesamodium pollicis pedis,
The bones of the foot.
and thus got at the root of the abductor muscle. Readjusting the battery, we now applied the fluid to the bisected nerves, when, with a movement of exceeding life-likeness, the mummy first drew up its right knee so as to bring it nearly in contact with the abdomen, and then, straightening the limb with inconceivable force, bestowed a kick upon Dr. Poniner, which had the effect of discharging that gentleman like an arrow from a catapult through a window into the street below. We rushed out en masse to bring in the mangled remains of the victim, but had the happiness to meet him upon the staircase, coming up in an unaccountable hurry, brimful of the most ardent philosophy, and more than ever impressed with the necessity of prosecuting our experiment with vigor and zeal. All right, kind of going to take over.
Oh, and we'll need a second reader because we have now a character. Is a second person. I guess I'll do it the first time.
Go ahead, Dick. You can still set up the chair.
Oh, we got it.
Dick's coming.
Great.
Yep. Okay. It was by his advice, accordingly, that we made, upon the spot, a profound incision into the tip of the subject's nose, while the doctor himself, laying violent hands upon it, pulled it into vehement contact with the wire. Morally and physically, figuratively and literally, was the effect electric. In the first place, the corpse opened its eyes and winked very rapidly for several minutes, as does Mr. Barnes in the pantomime. In the second place, it sneezed. In the third, it sat upon end. In the fourth, it shook its fist in Dr. Poniner's face. In the fifth, turning to Messieurs Glidden and Buckingham, it addressed them in very capital Egyptian thus.
I must say, gentlemen, that I am as much surprised as I am mortified at your behavior. Of Dr. Poniner, nothing better was to be expected. He is a poor little fat fool who knows no better. I pity and forgive him. But you, Mr. Glidden, and you, Silk, who have traveled and resided in Egypt until one might imagine you to the manner born, you, I say, who have been so much among us that you speak Egyptian fully as well, I think, as you write your mother tongue, you, whom I have always been led to regard as the firm friend of the mummies, I really did anticipate more gentlemanly conduct from you. What am I to think of your standing quietly by and seeing me thus unhandsomely used? What am I to suppose by your permitting Tom, Dick, and Harry to strip me of my coffins and my clothes in this wretchedly clothed climate? In what light, to come to the point, am I to regard your aiding and abetting that miserable little villain, Dr. Ponener, in pulling me by the nose? It will be taken for granted, no doubt.
No, that's me. That's me. It will be taken for granted, no doubt, that upon hearing this speech under the circumstances, we all either made for the door, or fell into violent hysterics, or went off in a general swoon. One of these three things was, I say, to be expected. Indeed, each and all of these lines of conduct might have been very plausibly pursued. And, upon my word, I am at a loss to know how or why it was that we pursued neither the one nor the other. But, perhaps, the true reason is to be sought in the spirit of the age, which proceeds by the rule of contraries altogether, and is now usually admitted as the solution of everything in the way of paradox and impossibility. Or, perhaps, after all, it was only the mummy's exceedingly natural and matter-of-course air that divested his words of the terrible. However this may be, the facts are clear, and no member of our party betrayed any very particular trepidation or seemed to consider that anything had gone very especially wrong. For my part, I was convinced it was all right, and merely stepped aside out of the range of the Egyptian's fist. Dr. Ponener thrust his hands into his breeches pockets, looked hard at the mummy, and grew excessively red in the face. Mr. Glidden stroked his whiskers and drew up the collar of his shirt. Mr. Buckingham hung up down his head and put his right thumb into the left corner of his mouth. The Egyptian regarded him with a severe countenance for some minutes, and at length, with a sneer, said,
Why don't you speak, Mr. Buckingham? Did you hear what I asked you, or not? Do take your thumb out of your mouth.
Mr. Buckingham, hereupon, gave a slight start, took his right thumb out of the left corner of his mouth, and, by way of indemnification, inserted his left thumb in the right corner of the aperture above mentioned. Not being able to get an answer from Mr. B, the figure turned peevishly to Mr. Glidden, and, in a peremptory tone, demanded in general terms what we all meant. Mr. Glidden replied at length, in phonetics, but for the deficiency of American printing offices and hieroglyphical type, it would afford me much pleasure to record here, in the original, the whole of his very excellent speech. I may as well take this occasion to remark that all the subsequent conversation in which the mummy took a part was carried on in primitive Egyptian, through the medium, so far as concerned myself and other untraveled members of the company, through the medium, I say, of Messieurs Glidden and Buckingham as interpreters. These gentlemen spoke the mother tongue of the mummy with inimitable fluency and grace, but I could not help observing that, owing, no doubt, to the introduction of images entirely modern and, of course, entirely novel to the stranger, the two travelers were reduced, occasionally, to the employment of sensible forms for the purpose of conveying a particular meaning. Mr. Glidden, at one period, for example, could not make the Egyptian comprehend the term politics until he sketched upon the wall, with a bit of charcoal, of a little carbuncle-nosed gentleman, out at elbows, standing upon a stump, with his left leg drawn back, right arm thrown forward, with his fist shut, the eyes rolled up toward heaven, and the mouth open at an angle of 90 degrees. Just in the same way of Mr. Buckingham failed to convey the absolutely modern idea wig until, at Dr. Ponnonner's suggestion, he grew very pale in the face and consented to take off his own. It will be readily understood that Mr. Glidden's discourse turned chiefly upon the vast benefits accruing to science from the unrolling and disemboweling of mummies, apologizing, upon this score, for any disturbance that might have been occasioned him, in particular, the individual mummy called Allamistakeo, and concluding with a mere hint, for it could scarcely be considered more, that, as these little matters were now explained, it might be as well to proceed with the investigation intended. Here, Dr. Ponnonner made ready his instruments. Anyone else want to read? Lynn's coming up.
Okay, and then we're going to keep Dick on the mummy, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In regard to the latter suggestion of the orator, it appears that Allamistakeo had certain scruples of conscience, the nature of which I did not distinctly learn, but he expressed himself satisfied with the apologies tendered, and getting down from the table, shook hands with the company all around. When this ceremony was at end, we immediately busied ourselves in repairing the damages which our subject had sustained from the scalpel. We sewed up the wound in his temple, bandaged his foot, and applied a square inch of black plaster to the tip of his nose. It was now observed that the Count, this was the title, it seemed, of Allamistakeo, had a slight fit of shivering, no doubt from the cold. The doctor immediately repaired to his wardrobe and soon returned with a black dress coat, made in Jennings' best manner, a pair of sky blue plaid pantaloons with straps, a pink gingham chemise, a flap vest of brocade, a white sack overcoat, a walking cane with a hook, a hat with no brim, patent leather boots, straw-colored kid gloves, an eyeglass, a pair of whiskers, and a waterfall cravat. Owing to the disparity of size between the Count and the doctor, the proportions being as 2 to 1, there was some little difficulty in adjusting these habiliments upon the person of the Egyptian. But when all was arranged, he might have been said to be dressed. Mr. Glidden, therefore, gave him his arm and led him to a comfortable chair by the fire, while the doctor rang the bell upon the spot and ordered a supply of cigars and wine. The conversation soon grew animated. Much curiosity was, of course, expressed in regard to the somewhat remarkable fact of Allamistakeo still remaining alive. That's Dennis,
Oh, I should. Okay, I should have thought
observed Mr. Buckingham.
that it is high time you were dead.
Why? Replied the Count.
Replied the Count, very much astonished.
I am little more than 700 years old. My father lived 1,000 and was by no means in his dotage when he died.
Here ensued a brisk series of questions and computations, by means of which it became evident that the antiquity of the mummy had been grossly misjudged. It had been 5,050 years and some months since he had been consigned to the catacombs at Eleutherus.
But my remark
Resumed Mr. Buckingham.
had no reference to your age at the period of internment. I'm willing to grant, in fact, that you are still a young man. And my allusion was to the immensity of time during which, by your own showing, you must have been done up in asphaltum.
In what?
Said the Count.
In asphaltum.
persisted Mr. B.
Ah, yes, I have some faint notion of what you mean. It might be made to answer, no doubt, but in my time we employed scarcely anything else than the bichloride of mercury. But
No, this is somebody else now.
do
We
it.
need another.
I'll be Dr. Ponomer. You can stay there.
Okay.
But yeah, sorry. But what are we especially at a loss to understand
Said Dr. Pononer.
is how it happens that, having been dead and buried in Egypt 5,000 years ago, you are here today all alive and looking so delightfully well.
had I been, as you say, dead,
Replied the Count.
it is more than probable that dead I should still be. For I perceive you are yet in the infancy of Calvinism and cannot accomplish with it what was a common thing among us in the old days. But the fact is, I fell into a catalepsy, and it was considered by my best friends that I was either dead or should be. They accordingly embalmed me at once. I presume you are aware of the chief principle of the embalming process?
Why, not altogether.
Why, I perceive a deplorable condition of ignorance. Well, I cannot enter into details just now, but it is necessary to explain that to embalm, properly speaking, in Egypt, was to arrest indefinitely all the animal functions subjected to the process. I use the word animal in its widest sense, as including the physical, not more than the moral and vital being. I repeat that the leading principle of embalmment consisted with us in the immediately arresting and holding in perpetual abeyance all the animal functions subjected to the process. To be brief, in whatever condition the individual was at the period of embalmment, in that condition he remained. Now, as it is my good fortune to be of the blood of the Scarabaeus, I was embalmed alive as you see me at present.
The blood of the Scarabaeus.
Exclaimed Dr. Pononer.
Yes, the Scarabaeus was the insignium or the arms of a very distinguished and very rare patrician family. To be of the blood of the Scarabaeus is merely to be one of that family of which the Scarabaeus is the insignium. I speak figuratively.
But what has this to do with your being alive?
Why, it is the general custom in Egypt to deprive a corpse before embalmment of its bowels and brains. The race of the Scarabaei alone did not coincide with this custom. Had I not been a Scarabaeus, therefore, I should have been without bowels and brains, and without either it is inconvenient to live.
I perceive that.
Said Mr. Buckingham.
And I presume that all the entire mummies that come to hand are of the race of Scarabaei.
Beyond doubt.
So we need a Mr. Glidden now, right? Somebody else?
Comment's coming up now.
I thought
Said Mr. Glidden very meekly.
that the Scarabaeus was one of the Egyptian gods.
One of the Egyptian what?
Exclaimed the mummy, starting to its feet.
Gods.
Repeated the traveler.
Mr. Glidden, I really am astonished to hear you talk in this style.
Said the Count, resuming his chair.
No nation upon the face of the earth has ever acknowledged more than one god. The Scarabaeus, the Ibis, etc., were with us, as similar creatures have been with others. The symbols or media through which we offered worship to the Creator, too august to be more directly approached.
There was here a pause. At length, the colloquy was renewed by Dr. Ponener.
It is not improbable then, from what you have explained,
Said he,
that among the catacombs near the Nile, there may exist other mummies of the Scarabaeus tribe in a condition of vitality.
There can be no question of it.
replied the Count.
All the Scarabaei embalmed accidentally while alive are alive now. Even some of those purposely so embalmed may have been overlooked by their executors and still remain in the tomb.
Will you,
I'll just read it for her. Will you be kind enough to explain
I said,
what
What
you
you-
mean by purposely so embalmed?
With great pleasure.
answered the mummy, after surveying me leisurely through his eyeglass, for it was the first time I had ventured to address him a direct question.
With great pleasure.
He said,
The usual duration of a man's life in my time was about 800 years. Few men died, unless by the most extraordinary accident, before the age of 600. Few lived longer than a decade of centuries, but 8 were considered the natural term. After the discovery of the embalming principle, as I have already described it to you, it occurred to our philosophers that a laudable curiosity might be gratified, and at the same time, the interests of science much advanced by living this natural term in installments. In the case of history, indeed, experience demonstrated that something of this kind was indispensable. An historian, for example, having attained the age of 500, would write a book with great labor and then get himself carefully embalmed, leaving instructions to his executors pro tem that they should cause him to be revivified after the lapse of a certain period, say 500 or 600 years. Resuming existence at the expiration of this time, he would invariably find his great work converted into a species of haphazard notebook. That is to say, into a kind of literary arena for the conflicting guesses, riddles, and personal squabbles of whole herds of exasperated commentators. These guesses, etc., which passed under the name of annotations or emendations, were found so completely to have enveloped, distorted, and overwhelmed the text that the author had to go about with a lantern to discover his own book. When discovered, it was never worth the trouble of the search. After rewriting it throughout, it was regarded as the bounden duty of the historian to set himself to work immediately in correcting, from his own private knowledge and experience, the traditions of the day concerning the epoch at which he had originally lived. Now, this process of rescription and personal rectification, pursued by various individual sages from time to time, had the effect of preventing our history from degenerating into absolute fable.
I beg your pardon.
said Dr. Ponener at this point, laying his hand gently upon the arm of the Egyptian.
I beg your pardon, sir, but may I presume to interrupt you for one moment?
By all means, sir.
Replied the Count, drawing up.
I merely wish to ask you a question.
Said the doctor.
You mentioned the historian's personal correction of traditions respecting his own epoch. Pray, sir, upon an average, what proportions of these Kabbalah were usually found to be right?
The Kabbalah, as you properly termed them, sir, were generally discovered to be precisely on a par with the facts recorded in the unrewritten histories themselves. That is to say, not one individual iota of either was ever known, under any circumstances, to be not totally and radically wrong.
But as it is quite clear
resumed the doctor.
that at least 5,000 years have elapsed since your entombment, I take it for granted that your histories at that period, if not your traditions, were sufficiently explicit on that one topic of universal interest, the creation, which took place, as I presume you are aware, only about 10 centuries before?
Sir,
Said Count Alamistagio. The doctor repeated his remarks, but it was only after much additional explanation that the foreigner could be made to comprehend them. The latter at length said hesitatingly,
the ideas you have suggested are to me, I confess, utterly novel. During my time, I never knew anyone to entertain so singular a fancy as that the universe, or this world, as if you will have it so, ever had a beginning at all. I remember once, and once only, hearing something remotely hinted by a man of many speculations concerning the origin of the human race. And by this individual, the very word atom or red earth, which you make use of, was employed. He employed it, however, in a generical sense, with reference to the spontaneous germination from rank soil, just as 1,000 of the lower genera of creatures are germinated. The spontaneous germination, I say, of fine, vast hordes of men simultaneously upspringing in 5 distinct and nearly equal divisions of the globe.
Here, in general, the company shrugged their shoulders, and one or two of us touched our foreheads with a very significant air. Mr. Silk Buckingham, first glancing slightly at the occiput and then at the syncoput of Alamistagio, spoke as follows.
The long duration of human life in your time, together with the occasional practice of passing it, as you have explained, in installments, must have had indeed a strong tendency to the general development and conglomeration of knowledge. I presume, therefore, that we are to attribute the marked inferiority of the old Egyptians in all particulars of science when compared with the moderns, and more especially with the Yankees, altogether to the superior solidity of the Egyptian skull.
I confess again,
Replied the Count with much suavity.
that I am somewhat at a loss to comprehend you. Pray, to what particulars of science do you allude?
Here our whole party, joining voices, detailed at great length the assumptions of phrenology and the marvels of animal magnetism. Having heard us to an end, the Count proceeded to relate a few anecdotes, which rendered it evidence that prototypes of Gaul and Spurzheim had flourished and faded in Egypt so long ago as to be nearly forgotten, and that the maneuvers of Mesmer were really very contemptible tricks when put in collation with the positive miracles of the Theban savants, who created lice and a great many other similar things. I here asked the Count if his people were able to calculate eclipses. He smiled rather contemptuously and said they were. This put me a little out, but I began to make other inquiries in regard to his astronomical knowledge, when a member of the company, who had never as yet opened his mouth, whispered in my ear that for information on this head, I had better consult Ptolemy, whoever Ptolemy is, as well as one Plutarch de Fasci Lunae. I then questioned the mummy about burning glasses and lenses, and in general about the manufacture of glass, but I had not made an end of my queries before the silent member again touched me quietly on the elbow and begged me for God's sake to take a peep at Diodorus Siculus. As for the Count, he merely asked me in the way of reply if we moderns possess any such microscopes as would enable us to cut cameos in the style of the Egyptians. While I was thinking about how I should answer this question, little Dr. Ponnonner committed himself in a very extraordinary way.
Oh, look at our architecture.
He exclaimed, greatly to the indignation of both the travelers, who pinched him black and blue to no purpose.
Look
He cried with enthusiasm.
at the Bowling Green fountain in New York. Or if this is to be too vast a contemplation, regard for a moment the Capitol at Washington, D.C.
And the good little medical man went on to detail very minutely the proportions of the fabric to which he referred. He explained that the portico alone was adorned with no less than 24 columns, 5 feet in diameter and 10 feet apart. The Count said that he regretted not being able to remember just at that moment the precise dimensions of any one of the principal buildings of the city of Aznek, whose foundations were laid in the night of time, but the ruins of which are still standing at the epoch of his entombment in a vast plain of sand to the westward of Thebes. He recollected, however, talking of the porticos, that one affixed to an inferior palace in a kind of suburb called Karnak consisted of 444 columns, 37 feet in circumference and 25 feet apart. The approach to this portico from the Nile was through an avenue 2 miles long, composed of sphinxes, statues, and obelisks, 20, 60, and 100 feet in height. The palace itself, as well as he could remember, was in one direction 2 miles long and might have been altogether about 7 in circuit. Its walls were richly painted over, within and without, with hieroglyphics. He would not pretend to assert that even 50 or 60 of the doctor's capitals might have been built within these walls, but he was by no means sure that 200 or 300 of them might not have been squeezed in with some trouble. That palace at Karnak was an insignificant little building after all. He, the Count, however, could not conscientiously refuse to admit the ingenuity, magnificence, and superiority of the fountain of the Bowling Green, as described by the doctor. Nothing like it, he was forced to allow, had ever been seen in Egypt or elsewhere. I here asked the Count what he had to say to our railroads.
Nothing
He replied,
in particular.
"They,"
Yeah, that's you.
that's me
That's
too.
you.
"They were rather slight, rather ill-conceived, and clumsily put together. They could not be compared, of course, to the vast, level, direct, iron-grooved causeways upon which the Egyptians conveyed entire temples and solid obelisks to 150 feet in altitude. I spoke of our gigantic mechanical forces. He agreed that we knew something in that way, but inquired how I should have gone to work in getting up the imposts of the lintels of even the little palace at Karnak. This question I concluded not to hear. And demanded if he had any idea of the artesian wells, but he simply raised his eyebrows. While Mr. Glidden winked at me very hard and said in a low tone that one had been recently discovered by the engineers employed to bore for water in the great oasis. I had mentioned, yeah,
Somebody else want to read this? How
Yeah.
about
Robert.
Robert should be back up.
I then mentioned our steel, but the foreigner elevated his nose and asked me if our steel could have executed the sharp carved work seen on the obelisks, and which was wrought together by edge tools of copper. This disconcerted us so greatly that we thought it advisable to vary the attack to metaphysics. We sent for a copy of a book called The Dial, and read out of it a chapter or two about something that is not very clear, but which the Bostonians call the Great Movement of Progress. The Count merely said that great movements were awfully common things in his day, and as for progress, it was at one time quite a nuisance, but it never progressed. We then spoke of the great beauty and importance of democracy, and were at much trouble in impressing the Count with a due sense of the advantages we enjoyed in living where there was suffrage ad libitum and no king. He listened with marked interest, and in fact seemed not a little amused. When we had done, he said that a great while ago there had occurred something of a very similar sort. 13 Egyptian provinces determined all at once to be free, and to set a magnificent example to the rest of mankind. They assembled their wise men and concocted the most ingenious constitution it is possible to conceive. For a while they managed remarkably well. Only their habit of bragging was prodigious. The thing ended, however, in the consolidation of the 13 states, with some 15 or 20 others, in the most odious and insupportable despotism that was ever heard of upon the face of the earth. I asked what was the name of the usurping tyrant. As well as the Count could recollect, it was Mob. Not knowing what to say to this, I raised my voice and deplored the Egyptians' ignorance of steam. The Count looked at me with much astonishment, but made no answer. The silent gentleman, however, gave me a violent nudge in the ribs with his elbows, told me I had sufficiently exposed myself for once, and demanded if I was really such a fool as not to know that the modern steam engine is derived from the invention of Hero through Solomon Decaeus. We were now in imminent danger of being discomfited, but as good luck would have it, Dr. Ponnonner, having rallied, returned to our rescue, and inquired if the people of Egypt would seriously pretend to rival the moderns in the all-important particular of dress. The Count, at this, glanced downward to the straps of his pantaloons, and then taking hold of the end of one of his coat-tails, held it up close to his eyes for some minutes. Letting it fall at last, his mouth extended itself very gradually from ear to ear, but I do not remember that he said anything in the way of reply. Hereupon we recovered our spirits, and the doctor, approaching the mummy with great dignity, desired it to say candidly, upon its honor as a gentleman, if the Egyptians had comprehended at any period the manufacture of either Ponnonner's lozenges or Brandeth's pills. We looked with profound anxiety for an answer, but in vain. It was not forthcoming. The Egyptian blushed and hung down his head. Never was triumph more consummate. Never was defeat borne with so ill a grace. Indeed, I could not endure the spectacle of the poor mummy's mortification. I reached my hat, bowed to him stiffly, and took leave. Upon getting home, I found it past 4 o'clock, and then went immediately to bed. It is now 10 a.m. I have been up since 7, penning these memoranda for the benefit of my family and of mankind. The former I shall behold no more. My wife is a shrew. The truth is, I am heartily sick of this life, and of the 19th century in general. I am convinced that everything is going wrong. Besides, I am anxious to know who will be president in 2045. As soon, therefore, as I shave and swallow a cup of coffee, I shall just step over to Poniner's and get embalmed for a couple hundred years.
So,
That's great.
comments,
Um,
thoughts?
let me.
Aliens built the pyramids. Couldn't have been done by human beings. I mean, look at the precision of the setting of the stones of the Incan buildings, pyramids. Couldn't have been done by human beings. Had to be aliens.
Right, and carrying those huge blocks of stones over those big distances. That's interesting, this thing he says about tracks that can carry stuff.
Actually, one popular theory now is that, well, one popular conspiracy theory that's taking hold amongst young people who don't know any better is that there were giant hominids that were human-like, but they were like 10 to 15 feet tall who would carry these giant blocks. Just more stupid things that people say.
Well, it's not, but it's just but Poe is what's he doing in the story? I mean, it's
Well, he's making fun of people. Well, because the way it starts is it's just this guy, who's like
five pounds of.
Well, it was one, but his wife embellishes, and sometimes you can't stop at you can't stop at one, so it's two, and then it's three, right? No, I know it's five, but
well, yeah, well, it's at least four, but it's then 5 bottles of stout.
But 2 or 3 is merely a single unit of difference, right? So
yeah. My wife will have it 5, but clearly she has confounded 2 very distinct affairs. The abstract number 5, I am willing to admit, but concretely, it has reference to bottles of brown stout. But he's saying he only had 4 pounds of Welsh rabbit, but he had 5 bottles of beer.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, no, see, this is great because these are the same people that are trying to lecture the mummy about democracy, about the wonders of the United States. But it's like, these people are.
Well, Poe tells us something, right, about the United States, doesn't he? 13 Egyptian provinces determined all at once to be free. They assembled their wise men. For a while, they managed remarkably well. Only their habit of bragging was prodigious. Sound familiar? Only their habit of bragging was prodigious. Look at the American economy and then look at what certain people say about it. The only thing that is prodigious in America is its bragging, not its economy. Today, now.
Yeah. Well, so then this is written, what, 1845? Yeah, 1845, April.
Right. So the country has only existed since 1789.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. Country's only existed for 56 years when he writes this.
So maybe we can, what at the end of that paragraph, he says, the thing ended, however, in the consolidation of the 13 states with some 15 or 20 others. I'm just trying to think about how many states had been added.
Oh, by 1845? Yeah.
Yeah, 1824, there were 25 states. So he's talking 1845. So there's a few others.
There are 27 states. Texas was admitted to the Union later that year in December of 1845. Florida had been admitted. Oh, okay. So Florida was the 27th state in March of 1845. And this is written in April of 1845, or published in April of 1845.
right.
Yeah, right. In the American Review Journal, which is actually just also interesting. I know that we failed to talk about where these things are published too, because that's an interesting question too. What was the American Review that they were publishing this?
Right, I guess I'm just wondering about the sentence. He seems to see the if we're taking it in the straightforward way, that yes, this is, I mean, obviously this is a reference to the United States, but he seems to be saying that the addition of all of these other states occurred under an insupportable despotism.
Yeah, because remember, Texas gets annexed in 1845.
Yeah, right.
And the war happens with Mexico, right? Of course, a lot of things are being seized at that point. Suppose not very happy with the United States at that time.
Oh, okay. See, now that's okay. That's making more sense, right? Because I forget that there's contemporary history too, of course.
Yeah, the Mexican War happens right after that. April 1846 to 48, it's the Mexican War. And Poe, Lincoln, others are very, very unhappy with that. Because it's a form of imperialism. It's an imperialist annexation. I mean, that is what happened with Mexico.
Yeah.
But any other views of this?
Yeah, because that's an interesting point, right? Yeah, the Mexican War is happening, but the criticism here is on the people. Obviously, he says the thing that killed it was mob. I mean, that's pretty on the nose as to what's that, supposed to be. But it's a great critique, because today, and I mean, I fall into this too. It's like, oh, the government is doing this, the government is doing that, right? The administrations are, but I think Poe understands the role of a citizen. So the person he's most critical of here is the character, not just the narrator, but of course, of the doctors, who are, they think they're know-it-alls. So he's identifying where the problem actually lies in this.
There are obviously several other things in this story. People, I think, might want to take a look at it and figure some of it out. There's a question about this business about the Scarabaeus, for example.
Oh yeah, the whole bloodline thing, right?
Yeah,
I come from,
because Scarabaeus is sometimes used as a symbol for Christ.
Oh.
The beetle. Think about a crab, maybe the easiest, or a beetle, like in the gold bug.
Right.
Right. And the idea is the uplifted arms are a symbol of resurrection. And obviously, the mummy is 5,000 years old.
Simultaneously, 5,700 years old.
Right.
Oh, there was also the question, because Mr. Glidden, I think, mentions that, that the Scarabaeus was one of the Egyptian gods. And then the mummy exclaims, well,
Egyptian what?
What, Egyptian what gods? Right. And then he talks about how, well, I'm astonished because, they're in no other nation, I think, could they have believed in multiple gods. And he says, we have this belief of one creator.
Right. She's saying that no civilization which is advanced is going to believe can be pagan.
Mhm.
Not if it's fundamentally advanced, because the notion of unifying principles is a natural conception.
Hmm.
The pagan idea is something different.
There's an attack on Kabbalah there too.
Oh yeah, that's the other thing, the Kabbalah, right?
All wrong.
Oh yeah, that's right. He was talking. They were talking about, but you're 5,000 years old. That means it was only a decade of centuries when life was created, right? Because isn't it the belief that the Earth or the universe only 6,000 years old, right? That's where that comes from.
Right.
And he's like, that was the other thing, the germination, and what was it? It was he said something about red Earth, red Adam, but he said at once hearing, I don't believe that it ever had the universe ever had a beginning at all. I remember once and only once hearing something remotely hinted by a man of many speculations concerning the origin of the human race. And by this individual, the very word Adam, and then he puts in parentheses, or red earth, which you make use of, was employed. He employed it, however, in a generical sense with reference to the spontaneous germination from rank soil, just as 1,000 of the lower genera of creatures are germinated. In spontaneous germination, I say, of 5 vast hordes of men simultaneously upspringing in 5 distinct and nearly equal divisions of the globe.
Yeah, this is an interesting area and one that we would have to go through in a different time, which involve people's ideas about the origin of the human race and whether or not that happened in various places simultaneously around the globe. This guy gets into a peculiar area, however, because that's one of the reasons that racists give for talking about black, brown, yellow, white, and red. That's where that comes from. Or it doesn't come from there, but it's one of these things that gets being thrown around. Yeah, see, that's an interesting thing. Just to say on the Scarabaeus thing, just a brief reference. This is from Ambrose. He's describing Christ, Saint Ambrose. This is in the 4th century, sometime around like 390 AD. Him meaning Christ. Him, I say, who as a Scarabaeus cried out to his father to forgive the sins of his persecutors. So the notion of Jesus and the Scarabaeus as a symbol for Jesus. So that's why that is Poe's saying these things are different things. So you're right that there are different images, but the image, like the lamb, which is used for Christ, for example, right, in Western contemporary Western Christian society of the 4th century, 2nd century, 3rd century, right? So Scarabaeus is also that. So what I would invite people to do with this one, well, of course, we're not going to really have this next week because it's going to be the day before the conference.
Oh yeah, I should probably say something about that, but go on.
Yeah, right. We won't be able to do a session because everybody's going to be busy doing other things.
Although, would we want to put up a reading of something? Well, I guess we can discuss that as we get closer.
Yeah, well, we could obviously read a story. There's one that would be probably entertaining if we can do a good reading of it and put it up, or get a good reading of it. Entertaining for those who have a certain sense of humor, and that would be Hop Frog.
Oh, that's a great one.
So, maybe that might be right to do.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So I'll just do one more pitch for the conference. So again, if you'd like to register for the conference, I'm going to share my screen here. That is happening May 24th, 25th. A beautiful vision for humanity in times of great turbulence. You heard me. If you're from the Jimmy Dore Show and you're tuned in, you heard me give this pitch once. And if you were on when I got on, You heard me give this pitch twice. But basically, it is a amazing lineup of living historical figures, great scientific intellectuals, and a future, a vision for a real future. And if you want to be a part of that in person, now is the time to register. The registration ends tomorrow at 12:01 a.m. or 11:59 p.m. to be exact. Yeah, midnight. That's right. Saturday at midnight is the last minute you could possibly register. I'm being told it's 9 p.m. on Saturday night. That is the last minute you can register. You are going to want to be there in person to meet some of the greatest minds that exist right now, not just to talk and, discuss, great ideas together. Actually, now that I'm thinking about it, it's kind of like the Phaedo, when Socrates says, like, wouldn't you like to meet Homer? Wouldn't you like to meet, some of these great people that, have written these things? And he says, I fear, however, our purpose would not be just to talk. And that's exactly what we're going to find out at this conference. Our purpose there is not just to talk, but to come out of that with a commitment for a viable future for the world as a whole. So with that being said, I'm going to stop my pitch there, and hopefully you won't see us next week. There may be a program next week, or maybe a pre-recorded reading of something, hopefully of Hop Frog, although that's what Dennis said. But, things can change between now and then. People know how to get in touch with me. You can reach out on X or on my website at boatvega.nyc. Dennis, you have anything else?
No, I don't. I just want to say to people that if you were on for the first time and heard this, may not be entirely clear what we do with Edgar Poe. The idea of our reading and what we're doing, and this goes to what we're discussing on this conference, is that the United States will have to, among its citizens, rebuild many of the institutions of self-government from the top down. But top down here doesn't mean from the Congress and the and banking sector or something like that. It means from the citizens deciding that they're going to use their minds, and they are going to reconceive of the institutions upon which this republic was in fact founded. And we're looking at the 250th birthday of the country as the time to do that, and the occasion to challenge people to think of themselves as having the obligation to perfect the Union, not to complain about it, but to perfect it. That's what the preamble to the Constitution calls us to do. That we, the people, in order to form a more perfect union, do ordain and establish the United States. And that has to be done in every generation, by every generation. So that's what the conference is about, but it's also what Poe lived to do. He was making a critique at his time of a nation that was only 56 years old. If you think about it, that's less time than has elapsed since the Kennedy assassination. That's 62 years. And so he was saying that in his time, from the time that the nation was constituted in 1789 until 1845, already that you had this despotism that characterized the United States, and it had to be overturned. So it's a useful way, I think, for us to think about what our purpose ought to be and how far short we're falling of that. And that shouldn't be something to be expected to be corrected coming from those that have been, shall we say, have usurped the mission, which is uniquely that of each generation of Americans to perform. People are not any longer called to account on that. That's what we are doing, and we're doing it on our own behalf. So it's not, you're not required to call yourself to account. You are simply, if you will, implored to do that. But on the other hand, only Americans are those that call themselves to that account. It's a voluntary association. The United States is a voluntary association, and it is not necessarily represented by the people that call themselves Americans, particularly those who are the so-called patriots who call themselves Americans. It's represented by those people that act on the basis of American principles, and those principles are only those that are embodied in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, not the prejudices and predilections, let's call it that, proclivities of people at a particular age or time. And I think the story really got at that. And that was the point of it and reading it tonight. So we certainly think everybody that can join us next week will benefit. Then from there, the idea is to have a free intellectual exchange and association that is birthed from that, for which we are asking people to think about their possible role.
Okay. All right. With that, I'm going to end the stream. And we are.